So there's like some deeper structure, like I was explaining in the last video, where Mario as like a avatar. Under that is probably consciousness, and even under consciousness, there's probably a deeper structure. And it made us get into a conversation here where I was saying like, okay, the observer brings everything into existence. And then I was saying like my dad was a hustler and he was a realtor. Well, one of his 100 jobs, he was a realtor. And we walked into this old house once and there were O trains on the floor, like these model trains, the larger ones. Why were there O trains laying in that building and not apples? And you said, well, someone brought the O trains there. Is that what you said?
A previous memory of an observer manipulated the environment, and then you're experiencing.
Okay, so a previous memory of an observer, so it's been kind of imprinted, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
But why for that first observer was it an O train, was my question. Like, you could just keep going back infinitely. Why for the very first observer who walked in that room was it an O train and not an apple? It kind of implies like whatever that structure is under consciousness that's like running this whole thing, there's something like deeply complex under this whole structure. Just like the file on the desktop has extremely complex machine code under it. It looks simple like a file, but it's extremely complex. That thing, whatever is running this whole thing, why did it make it? Okay, I walked in, I collapsed the wave function, and it became an O train. But I guess, like, why was it an O train instead of an apple? That's a really confusing question to me. I guess you could say, well, the Higgs field exists everywhere, and the Higgs, the mass of those particles and the configuration of those in the Higgs field made it an O train, right? That's one way to explain it.
It could be an efficiency thing too, like the prior memory of an observer.
But the problem with that whole prior memory thing is the very first observer didn't have a prior memory.
What do you mean by first observer?
Whoever walked in that room very first and saw an O train?
Not the owner of the O train.
Yeah, whoever walked in and saw the O train, they didn't have any other, there was no other person to pass on the memory.
Well, right, that's what I'm saying.
Well, why for them did the wave function collapse into an O train?
Well, because I think there could be the memory of the prior observer who left the trains there to make
the owner of the train?
The owner of the trains, not the first observer of the train, whoever had the trains.
Mm-hmm. So that implies that everyone's linked through a consciousness, right?
Yeah, but it's also easier in a way. It's more efficient for a sim to say like, well, this is the previous configuration that it was at. So why would I bring up an apple when I can bring up the previous configuration?
Gotcha.
Less energy, I would imagine.
So basically a variable is being passed from one function. The function would be something like leave item. Hold item, leave item. These would be like the functions. Leave item.
Right.
So there would be a variable at the end of that said what the item was, and that would be based on the configuration of the Higgs field's mass, right? Whatever mass it had and whatever arrangement of those atoms. In this case, it was arranged in a way to be an O train.
Yeah.
So that variable then gets spit out of that function. Observer. The function could be observer, called like observer leaves item. And it could say, if this is just like an if then else. If observer walks into a room and leaves item, then next observer sees item. And an item would be a variable with a like a numerical number in the Higgs field. So the next else, what would be the other else? Else, what? He didn't leave item then? Else observer left with item, or else observer. Yeah, else observer left with item could be the if then else statement. I guess there could be other. But yeah, so it could pass that, it could store that variable, that information of the Higgs field. So then the next person walks in, that function gets called. It'll be called item left. And item left will just receive the information from that last variable.
Yeah.
And then it's all of a sudden a train.
It's almost like,
Well, that's pretty interesting.
yeah.
That could be, actually.
And it sort of reminds me of, let's say someone is playing a video game and they save their spot.
Yeah.
And then you could come in as a different player. You could open up their game and they're still saved at that spot.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so again, it's back to being a sim and a computer.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is it could be actually storing and passing variables. This is a breakthrough, actually. Because why is life so, amazingly consistent? That's always a table that's...
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
it could be exactly this, where a variable was stored, and unless something happens to that object and it gets rearranged, the variable remains stable.
Right.
Why would a variable just randomly change in a computer program? I mean, it doesn't,
It would
unless
not.
it's acted upon by other functions
Right.
or,
Like, let's say the house got flooded.
yeah,
That would be an example of another variable that would affect you coming into that house. The O trains would be all over the place.
right.
They wouldn't be in the same spot as...
So that could be a function called weather.
Right.
And if weather got, extreme enough, the Higgs field would have to calculate the variable of weather and pass it into the... So there's a lot of variables being calculated and passed around. This is an extremely complex program, obviously,
Right.
but the sheer number of variables being stored and passed around is amazing. So it's really not surprising that there's glitches sometimes and people see a ghost or people see this or that or something moves.
It's honestly amazing that we don't see weird shit.
Yeah. Remember that time that glass moved on the counter?
Yeah.
That could just be, there's so many complex variables being stored. That could have just been a rounding error.
Yeah.
Maybe it was supposed to be 7.312 and then it's stable. And instead it went to 7.31. And for some reason that part of the code cut off a decimal place.
Man,
That's all it takes maybe to move something.
we had a bunch of electrical stuff on that night. I was singing through a microphone. What if the sound waves got a little bit too excited than normal and was able to move a highly dense object?
Yeah.
Isn't that
But I'm
possible?
talking more about the Higgs field itself, where these variables are clearly being stored in it. It has to work that way because otherwise things wouldn't be stable.
Yeah.
So a way to explain something weird happening is something happened to the variable in the Higgs field, the ones that's being stored. If something happens to it where it either gets corrupt or there's a rounding error in it or something happens to it where the data is not quite stable where it should be, I wonder if then you could get these weird things we see.